that gives us a sense. Thank you very much. That gives us a sense of what is happening globally. But now we are gearing up for our first panel discussion, and that is an introduction to global human flourishing. Now, to answer this key question, what does it mean for all to flourish? What does it mean? We are joined by VanderWeele, who's professor at Harvard University. We have Celidwen, postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. Okay, I believe there's a problem with my sound. I have unmuted it. I'm not sure if you can all hear me. Okay, so I was just saying, in case you just missed all of that, we have our first panel discussion. We're gearing up for that. It is an introduction to global human flourishing. And we are answering the key question, what does it mean for all to flourish? Let me introduce you to my esteemed panelists this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are. And first up is VanderWeele, who's professor at Harvard University. We are delighted to welcome Celidwen, postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. And we have Ambassador Diane Gashumba, ambassador from Rwanda to the Nordics. And of course, we have Thupten Jinpa Langri, who is the president of the Compassion Institute. To launch our discussion, we have a video from VanderWeele to get us started.
I'm VanderWeele at Harvard University and will be presenting today on flourishing and the global flourishing study. I'll make some remarks on the concept of flourishing, our attempts to assess flourishing, and then talk about this new research endeavor, the Global Flourishing Study. More information on the conception of flourishing I'll be presenting is in this 2017 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. More information on the Global Flourishing Study can be found on our program's website. If we turn to our institutions and academic disciplines, we often find that they aspire to very grand visions of human flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Disciplines like economics or psychology likewise aspire to grand visions of flourishing. But in practice, many of our discussions and studies are restricted to much narrower outcomes, specific disease states, simple measures of feeling happy, or just to income. So what is flourishing? If we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, defines flourishing as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is that flourishing, or a complete state of well-being, is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, but this is arguably what we're after as individuals and should be seeking as a society. I think the discipline that's come closest to trying to assess this is that of positive psychology. Numerous conceptualizations and measures of psychological well-being have been introduced, but notably absent from these measures of psychological well-being are any notion of physical health, and are we really fully flourishing if we're bedridden or seriously ill? Often missing from these conceptualizations is any notion of character or virtue. Contrary to Plato, Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical and religious traditions worldwide. But with a conception so broad, it's never really possible to measure or assess flourishing, and moreover, won't conceptions differ across individuals and cultures and religious and theological traditions? Can we ever really achieve consensus? And while I think it is the case that well-developed conceptions of flourishing will vary across traditions, what I would argue is that however flourishing is understood, any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but each is a part of it. These 5 are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, I would not argue that these exhaust flourishing, but each is a part of it. I think each of these domains also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this as well. And each is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think these 2 criteria, being nearly universally desired and being an end, might help shape consensus around what to measure. As a very brief, crude assessment of flourishing, we've proposed an index which takes 2 questions, and each of these 5 domains drawn principally from the existing work on well-being questions regularly used in practice that have received some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 questions which are newly proposed here are those in the character domain, where we worked with philosophers to develop more global assessments based on the tradition of the cardinal virtues. So the 5 domains and the 10 questions we are using are as follows. First, with happiness and life satisfaction, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Scored 0, completely unsatisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. This is one of the most widely used well-being questions in the literature by the OECD, by the UK's annual survey, and many other surveys as well. We supplement that with something more effective on feeling happy. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Second domain, physical and mental health, questions taken from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 to 10. How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10. Third domain, meaning and purpose. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? Again, used by OECD, UK's annual survey, and others. And we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. The fourth domain, character and purpose. First question intended in some crude way to try to assess practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, completely untrue of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then a second question intended in some crude way to assess fortitude or courage and temperance or moderation. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness assessment of short survey items. First, I am content with my friendships and relationships, intended to capture the quantity or extent of those relationships. And then secondly, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, intended to capture the quality of those relationships. In our research, we typically look at these 5 domains separately, but we'll sometimes average the questions for an overall flourishing assessment, but this really should be understood as nothing other than a composite of those 5 more meaningful domains. We typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability, intended as important means to sustain those other ends. And these 2 questions are, how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0 to 10, how often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? As an example of how this sort of assessment can be useful, this is data from the United States in a roughly nationally representative sample, both prior to the WHO declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic in January of 2019 and also in the midst of the pandemic in June 2020. In January 2020, most of these domains had an average score of about 7. The one exception was financial and material stability, which was a full point lower. Unsurprisingly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, well-being in these various domains went down on average, but it affected some domains more than others. We saw substantial declines in happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, and financial and material stability, about a point in each of these domains. But the declines were much smaller with regard to meaning and purpose, with regard to character assessments, and even with regard to close social relationships, somewhat surprisingly. But assessments like this help us understand what's going well, what's not, who might need help, and how are things changing over time. So we've been carrying out these sorts of assessments in a number of different settings, workplace settings, clinical settings, educational settings. We've embedded this assessment into various cohort studies to try to empower research in this area. And we hope by these assessments we'll be able to better understand the distribution and determinants of well-being, but also to give communities a sense, once again, of what's going well, what's not, who needs help, how are things changing over time. So our most recent research initiative is this Global Flourishing study, which is a partnership between the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and Baylor's Institute for the Studies of Religion, with data collection to be carried out by Gallup and funding from the Templeton Philanthropies and a number of other funders as well. This study will consist of 240,000 individuals in 22 geographically and culturally and religiously diverse countries representing roughly half of the world's population. We'll be doing nationally representative sampling with Gallup in each of these countries, and then we'll be following the same cohort of 240,000 individuals annually for at least 5 years to understand the distribution of flourishing in year one, and then as time goes on, the factors that shape these different aspects of flourishing. We'll be asking a rich set of well-being questions, including the Flourishing Index questions, but other well-being questions also, and also looking at the various social and family and childhood and religious and political and economic and demographic contexts that help give rise to flourishing. We'll be able to ask questions along the lines of, what factors most powerfully affect these different aspects of flourishing? How does this vary by country and cultural context? And what might be universal? This will be an open access data resource hosted by the Center for Open Science, so the data will be publicly available. And so we hope that this study helps us understand the distribution and determinants of well-being, helps us to do so with our own research teams, but helps others around the world to better study, understand, and hopefully ultimately contribute to human flourishing. Thank you.
All right, so that was a very inspirational and challenging presentation by Tyler VanderWeele, and it gets us nicely into our discussion. And at this point, we want to really ask specific questions around what is needed to flourish, what is missing, what can we do differently, and most importantly, where do we start? Where should we focus first? So let's get on with it then. I'm posing this question to all of you. Tyler VanderWeele spoke of what we know and are learning about human flourishing globally. From your point of view, what else do we need to understand and do before we can flourish? So let me see who I can pick on first. Jinpa, let me pick on you first. Jinpa Langri, perhaps you can share your thoughts on that.
Thank you. That was a densely packed video presentation, and I'm very impressed by the scale and the ambition of the study, as well as both the countries represented as well as the resources that are being poured in. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that this is a very comprehensive perspective being brought to the question of human flourishing. One critical observation that I have is that, it is very comprehensive in the sense that it captures the physical, economic, social, emotional, and psychological dimension of human flourishing and human being. I'm very happy to see that the social side is included, because often in this kind of study, there is a kind of a bias that kicks in, which is coming from a very contemporary kind of scientific understanding of who human beings are, which is very individualistic. So everything is really perspective from the individual. So often the relationality and social dimension gets left out. So this particular study has the social dimensions included in that conception. But what I would argue is lacking is the communal dimension, which is harder. But historically, ever since known history of human beings have never been this individualistic. We have always been part of a community. And sense of belonging has been a very important part of who we are and our sense of well-being. So my request, as well as the critical observation, is to find a way to include the communal dimension. We know, for example, even from the psychological studies of health, sense of belonging is really crucial. Now, it's more complicated because it brings in the communal dimension to this kind of study. But for this kind of scale and resources being put into a concept which is understood to be, ambition here is to be universal, so that it's not centric to any particular perspective, whether Western or Eurocentric or whatever. So the aim is to be universal. So in that case, I think, for it to be truly comprehensive, my request is to really, for people who are involved in this, to find ways to really, sort of sit down and crack their brains to see how can we bring in this communal dimension and what does it mean? Because human beings have never really been without a community. So communities shift in modern times because of the very mobile nature of our modern life. But there's always a community, and we are always part of a group. in a whatever way we may identify. So there is an objective dimension to the aspect of the communal dimension, but there is also an individual personal dimension to our sense of belonging. So that would be my request and my critical observation for what is missing in this big picture.
And Yuria, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, just building also on what Jinpa has just said. I mean, you are known for speaking about self-transcendence, and Jinpa spoke about the communal aspect. I suspect this is what you mean when you talk about belonging. What are your thoughts?
Wokola wolik yu untela baibe kontakpe yu untetaleshe. Akich temuk telum kinal yu unkushineletik wichun holone tebanti ayone nawa sok maya etik tastoihelans kinal Chiapas. You just heard my indigenous Maya language, from which I am honoring the lands of the Huichin Ohlone tribe of the Bay Area where I'm speaking today. I'm also honoring the Nahua and Maya peoples of my ancestors, where I was born and raised of the highlands of Chiapas in Mexico. And I bring the indigenous nations of the world that as we are gathering in this global conference, this is such a great opportunity to bring the voices of those communities that have not had those platforms to speak, but that have keen solutions for the problems that the world is living right now. And in a way, bringing the languages is also challenging the human othering as we create awareness of the massive cultural extinction that we are living that follows biodiversity loss. I believe that this is in itself a determinant of planetary flourishing. And what I see in the presentation of Brother Tyler, how much focus it is on human flourishing, human health and happiness. And then also the patterns that they have discovered, the financial ranked lowest, that connection is higher abroad, that happiness is higher in developed countries, but purpose in developing countries. And also that the definition of health is from 1948. So things have changed already. So what's missing? And I think this is the very elusive art of pointing the water to the fish. And what's missing is the whole of Mother Earth. So indigenous worldviews agree that human flourishing originates from a healthy environment. That is, there's no human flourishing without planetary flourishing. So these indigenous worldviews, in its huge diversity of more than 5,000 indigenous nations the world over, they agree on the keen responsibility that we have to care and to revere Mother Earth. And so I insist that there's no human flourishing without ensuring Mother Earth's flourishing first. So when I speak of self-transcendence, I'm talking about that kind of reverence, respect, responsibility to our environments and the reciprocity that we tend all living beings around. So these, fortunately, starting to change. There's this, since 2017, there's a new approach. It's called the One Health approach that recognizes that health of humans, animals, plants, and the wider environment is really what's important for our flourishing. And just last year, there was a resolution to recognize the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So I feel that this is what we need to focus. The whole of the earth. How do we come together to ensure that there's flourishing for everyone?
And I can see, you know, the background really is in alignment with your words there, Yuria. And you'd be delighted to know that even in the School of Politics where I am now, they are teaching planetary politics precisely because there's now an awareness that human beings are not the only life force in the world. So thank you very much for reminding us of that. And Ambassador, I do want to bring you in here. I am glad that we have representation at that diplomacy level. We've just concluded COP27, and I think what Yuria is speaking of, the urgency, the importance that we are really facing the abyss unless we incorporate flourishing in the way that we do politics. So from that point of view, how do you understand flourishing globally and what is missing?
The way I understand flourishing is caring for others. And before you expect others to care about yourself, you care about them. And everybody needs peace, everybody needs life, everybody needs education, health, and everybody needs a home, a safe home. So before aspiring to this and claiming it as a right, what is missing is that we don't think about others enough. We live in a selfish world, unjust world, and what is missing is this component of thinking about others, but most importantly, respecting others' values, others' culture, and keep thinking on a daily basis that we are part of the same community, the same world, and we need to support each other. But most importantly, as I said, respecting others. That is what I think is missing in this community we live in. Thank you.
Thank you. Jinpa, let me go back to you. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and you have worked tirelessly to promote the science and practice of kindness and compassion around the world. Is the key to flourishing that simple, really? And I ask this because we live in a world exactly where our planetary politics are not in alignment, where we have a war on Ukraine. The Horn of Africa has a famine that is imminent. There are people who don't have enough to eat. So if human flourishing is that simple, why are we not getting it right?
Thank you. I had the privilege to serve His Holiness as his principal interpreter for now almost 40 years. And you're right, he has been very focused on the message of bringing compassion to the broader world. And part of that is really coming from his Buddhist background, where there is a real emphasis on prioritizing among all the virtues and human qualities, compassion. And this is exactly what Ambassador is pointing to, the ability, natural ability to care for others' well-being. And the reason why someone like His Holiness, and particularly, you know, in my own work as well, we emphasize compassion is that compassion, one advantage is it's a natural human quality. And we generally tend to not to pay too much attention, and partly because the history of compassion advocacy is a little complicated. It used to be slotted in the religious values, and as societies become less religious, people pay less attention to these virtues. But now science is pointing out, actually, compassion is a very natural human part of human nature, and in fact, it's one of the powerful factors that makes us human, because we are relational, deeply relational, and we know that, you know, our relationships really matter, and our sense of well-being and happiness is really tied to our relationship with people in our lives. And this quality and at the root of compassion is this capacity to empathize with even a total stranger whom you have no personal relationship, but because of shared human condition. So the suggestion here is that if we can all dig deep and connect with that natural aspect of who we are, which is at a very deep level of human nature, then from that place, we will see the world and relate to the world in quite a different way. So I would argue, even with respect to planetary health, attitudes and perceptions matter. And our attitude to nature up until recently has been that of an object that can be exploited for human uses. But if we completely change that attitude and bring sense of concern, sense of caring in our perspective in relationship to nature, in our perspective in relationship with people in our life, to members of the other communities. If we are able to relate to others at this very fundamental, basic level of just like me, this too is a human being, just like me, this person too doesn't want to suffer, wants to be happy. This simple, fundamental recognition is the heart of the perspective that compassion brings. And yes, I would argue that if you look at the list on the human flourishing qualities that are listed there, maybe the economic dimension may not be promoted by compassion, but if you look at the psychological well-being, emotional well-being, social well-being, all of these, and as well as virtue and character, I would argue by emphasizing compassion, by embracing our own compassionate nature, by making a compassion an active force in our world, in our life, the way we look at others, the way we relate to others, the way we relate to the world, all of these other qualities, aspects that you see in the human flourishing list would be promoted. So in some sense, yes, it is that simple. It's just getting to the basics.
Yuri, I'm dying to hear your thoughts on this one. And I'll tell you why I'm asking this, because there's often a perspective that compassion and caring, these are just soft issues. They have nothing to do with our economic goals, our developmental goals. I bet you if you were to speak to a whole lot of policymakers and say, with more kindness, a more astute awareness of the importance of the planet, of our environment, of each other, if we were to just break down the hierarchies that we have built where because we are the rational people, then we are superior, then it's the planet, then it's the animals, that kind of hierarchy that has not gotten us anywhere. How would you persuade a skeptic that, hold on, the attributes of flourishing that Jinpa has spoken about, that the ambassador has spoken about, that you have articulated, that these are fundamental to even achieving economic goals for different countries?
Well, speaking about the transcending the narrowness, the narrow view that it's only us that matter, or that there's that hierarchy in which there's one at the top and then the rest. That's self-interested. It's a very narrow view that doesn't allow us to really flourish together. Within indigenous traditions, the deep cultural traditions of wisdom, there's a keen perception of the consciousness of Mother Earth. So that very clear awareness that there's an embodied knowledge in which we relate with the whole of the environment, that the environment responds to us as well. There's consciousness and then there's response. So this relational capacity is based on collaboration. It is based on compassion. We are caring for the earth. We are reverencing life on earth. And the teachings of transcendence speak about this realizing the nuance of relationships. In a way, it's like an embodiment of action-oriented practices. Like we enter into engagement with the whole of the community, but the community of living beings. Not only human communities, but we realize we are part of a larger system that is responsive and impacted by our presence. So we become aware of how responsible we are for what we're bringing to the world. So it's, in a way, it's aiming to transform the basic nature of the seed into the spiritual awareness of the forest, or of the grove. So going from self-interest to collective flourishing. Now, it's something that I like to call the kin relationality, in which we see everything that exists as kin. And ecological belonging, that is that we are part of much larger systems, living systems, responsive systems, conscious systems, in which we relate and we flourish. So this being aware of we are part of life cycles and of life, and then again realizing that everything is so sensitive and fragile and yet as well resilient, brings us this awareness of reverence that, again, I insist, there is no human flourishing without Mother Earth flourishing first. So when speaking with policymakers, there is that aim to bring awareness of that ethics of belonging, that I like calling it. That is, we humans flourish as we awaken to our responsibility as caretakers of the ecosystem. We're enacting our exceptional capacity for co-creation and participation in a nourishing, relational, empowering, and transformative force that is Mother Earth.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, can I bring you in here? And I don't want to focus too much on Rwanda's very painful past, but I think that it is a worthy case study if we are talking about rebuilding and flourishing. Everyone knows that Rwanda experienced a brutal genocide in 1994, and that the aftermath, the world didn't care. It took years for the global community to stand up and say, this is not right. I believe, as painful as that is, it gives you a vantage point in Rwanda about what it takes to care for another, to accommodate difference, to be part of a community across culture, across race, across geography. So I would like to know that from a governance point of view, from the state that you represent, what are your priorities as you make your journey towards creating a shared flourishing, as it were, for a diverse society such as Rwanda?
The priority for Rwanda is our people, is everyone, is equal right to opportunities, and is leaving no one behind, but most importantly, putting these into actions. And it wasn't easy after the genocide against the Tutsi, after losing 1 million lives, innocent lives, after having people fleeing the country, and all the sad experiences we went through. As a human being, the first reaction and the first feeling would be to revenge, would have been to revenge, and systematically. And but as you asked, we decided to rebuild our country, but it took a strong leadership. It required a strong leadership, because even within a family of 5 people, we need someone who drives a decision, who drives a choice. And the choice we've made to rebuild our country together, and the choice we've made to bridge all the inequities and not to revenge and to forgive, this choice needed someone to drive it and someone to make sure that it is really applied and people understand. They don't just do it because someone said it. They believe in it and realize the consequences of not doing so. So that's what we call the positive leadership, a leadership that cares for the people, President Kagame's leadership. And what we have now is a country that is still in this process, because it doesn't happen overnight. But we went through a long process of unity and reconciliation. We chose to be one nation. We chose to stop the politics of discrimination that led us to this genocide against the Tutsi. And today, if I would just want to talk about one indicator that shows that we are on a very good track, we are in a good direction. If you look at, for example, the life expectancy in 1993, 1 year before the genocide, it was 26 life expectancy in Rwanda. And today we are at 67.
Mm-hmm.
It means a lot, and it required like a comprehensive politics and strategies, poverty reduction, but consideration of everybody. And we have a politics that is community-based. That's what has led us to this achievement. So that is the politics we chose. And we agreed to focus on and to protect and to preserve. And it wasn't easy because we didn't, as you said, we didn't get like the support you would think a nation that is completely destroyed would expect from the international community. But hopefully we've got good friends, good partners of Rwanda, some of the foreign countries, organizations, but the first energy came from inside the country and specifically inside our leaders. And today we celebrate good achievement in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of a country that is known for zero tolerance to corruption, but most importantly, equal right to opportunities. We are the first country across the world with a high number of women in the parliament, and the first country that has a strong primary healthcare system and community-based insurance that covers everybody. So that's what I can say about the experience of my country.
Right. Junta, can I just bring you in here? I mean, we see a practical example of incorporating inclusion and a sense of community. So is it challenging really to cultivate habits and norms that promote flourishing? Where do we start, both at an individual level, but also at this community level, which then becomes the global level? How do we begin to cultivate habits and norms that promote flourishing so that it becomes mainstream in the way that we relate to each other, in the way that we teach, in the way that we make policy and govern our societies?
His Holiness has been a strong advocate of really starting at the school system somehow, because the modern education, is education spaces where we create the younger generation of the citizens. And so how we educate children is really going to impact the kind of culture and society we're going to produce. So His Holiness has been a big advocate of bringing teaching of ethics and compassion and social emotional awareness at the school level so that children learn to regulate their emotions, tap into the better part of human nature, have a deeper appreciation of the importance of environment, human responsibility towards ecology. All of these, he believes, but it is the long-term strategy, and I don't know, the climate crisis suggests probably we may not have that kind of time. So, and just as Ambassador pointed out, a large part of that is leadership, and human impulse to seek revenge is very, very real, and human beings are very complex creatures, and to what aspects of our psychology we tap into will determine how we react and respond to a crisis. So in these crisis situations, leaderships matter because they set the tone and they create a shared language and shared value, which then trickles down. So we saw a similar example in South Africa in the aftermath of the dismantling of anti-apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela's leadership really led the way to a total, much more reconciliatory approach rather than the majority seeking a revenge to the injustices of the past. So there are, in these crisis moments, leaderships really matter. But I think in the end, it's really awareness at the personal individual level. And my argument here is to really suggest, use self-interest arguments, even for the personal self-interest point of view, taking compassion seriously, caring for others is in our own self-interest benefit. Because if you wish, at the end of the day, when we go to bed, before going to bed, look into the mirror, we want to feel good about ourselves. Everybody wants to feel good about ourselves. There, if you are less selfish, if you care more for people in your life, if you're a bit more compassionate, you feel better about yourselves. So it's in this way, I think we change one person at a time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Yuri, can I just bring you in here again, just talking about the potential towards human flourishing? Where do you think we should start right now with the tools that we have, and how do we cultivate those tools?
Well, where do we start? Where do we continue? I think it's so important what Sister Ambassador Diane and also Brother Jinpa have been saying. Developing community awareness. bringing voices of marginalized communities. And I feel it's really important to start working with intergenerational participation, both with our children, our youth, and also with our elders. After looking at community organization, also started working with intercultural perspectives in sciences, technologies, health, flourishing itself. And then push. Yes, we do need policy. Push for intergovernmental action and for real political commitment, because that's missing. But in the end, it is the grassroots movements that will demand these political commitments to really happen. So I think that it's really important that we start working towards that and to bring all these voices that haven't really had a space before to be participants of the change as well.
Mm-hmm. And I like what you're saying, be the participants of the change. And Ambassador, I want to bring you in here. Even within the same country, there are different resources, there's different connectivity, there's inequality even within the same community. Do you think that it is possible as a global community, with all the resources that we have, to bring everyone in, to not leave everyone behind?
It's possible. It just takes to think about it and to be convinced that we would have a better world by doing so. As you rightly stated, even within a country, this situation is present, and we know that, even within like a small community. But it takes to make a decision to change this and to like be convinced that everyone needs like a healthy life, needs a positive life, and reduce the level of selfishness. So I would say it's possible, but it's not easy. So it takes like a lot of energy and maybe some leaders to sit together and to listen to each other, and also to learn from experience. When I hear everyone's talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, so what I'm waiting for is to see if people will like put into actions what they say as what they call lesson learned, and all they mention about what they went through and the inequities and the lack of collaboration among nations and within countries. So it's possible, but difficult, but doable.
Possible. Okay, let's leave it on that positive note. Thupten, Jinpa, Langri, Ambassador Diane, Gashumba, Yuria, Celidwen, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about what it means to achieve global human flourishing, the obstacles thereto, and the absolute potential, because I think that's the message that has come through, that challenging as it is absolutely possible to achieve human flourishing for all.